thank you. Good to see a lot of you who've come in the past. Good to meet a few new folks. What Billy didn't mention was the two most important people here today are Rob, who went and got the donuts, and whoever made the coffee. I'm not sure who that was, but whoever made the coffee. Thank you very much. We are going to talk about the V2 today. It was a rocket that at one time was the most superior rocket in the entire world. It was a wonder weapon during World War II from the Germans, and we brought many parts of it over to New Mexico at the end of World War II, and that helped to start our rocket program along with the Germans we brought, because they were far better at the technology than we were here in the United States. So I call this Vengeance to Victory to Vehicle. Those are the three, in my reading and research, the three most important stages of the V2. First of all, the Vengeance weapon was what it was called during Germany, the moniker during World War II, because a lot of people died when Germany launched it against the Allies. Victory, when we were able to bring it over here and jumpstart our rocket program. And Vehicle, because if not for this rocket and the expertise behind the rocket, very likely we might not have gone through the space race as well as we did in the time frame that we did. In looking through this, the first, of course, at the top of the list is Dr. Wernher von Braun. And notable in this photograph right here is this gentleman here. The English pronunciation is Hermann Oberth. The German pronunciation, I've been told, is Dr. Hermann Oberth. And in 1922, he wrote a doctoral thesis that said man would one day go to the moon and other planets. And you can imagine, that was more than 100 years ago, and his doctoral advisors looked at that thesis and had a good laugh over it. Yeah, right, that's never going to happen. You might remember in the late 1800s, the head of the patent office said that everything that has been invented has been invented, and nothing new will ever be invented. So in 1922, at that time, Hermann Oberth was not awarded his doctorate. Subsequently, he would get it. But he was frustrated. There were three folks in the world at that time working on rocketry. It was Hermann Oberth, it was Tsiolkovsky in Russia, and in the United States, it was Robert Goddard in Massachusetts and subsequently in New Mexico. Goddard was the only one actually doing at that time actual launches and more than theoretical experiments until 1923, when frustrated, Oberth published his book and called it The Rocket into Planetary Space. Now, as timing would have it, sometimes timing is everything, Wernher von Braun was 11, 12 years old, and he read that book, and it got him excited. So excited, he started building model rockets and launching them in the square of his hometown. They would hit food carts. They would go through windows of buildings. And his father paid out a good portion of money to fix things. But the excitement continued to grow and grow. So imagine, he's 11, 12 years old. He reads this book, and at age 19, he is building rockets for the German army in just that short a time span. In 1939, he actually sent a rocket to 35,000 feet in just 60 seconds. So they took the idea of rocketry to Adolf Hitler, and the Nazis, when they took power in 1933, had no interest in this technology whatsoever. They were very clear about that. They took this technology to Adolf Hitler, who didn't believe in it whatsoever. And it's one of those what-if cases. What would have happened in the 1930s if the hierarchy in Germany had embraced that rocket technology? The Air staff, the Air Ministry staff, actually laughed at them and smirked and said, our Luftwaffe will take care of our war. So greatly discouraged, and remember, at that point, the Luftwaffe was very active, but by 1945, guess what? There was no fuel to fly the Luftwaffe planes. And so it came down to rocketry helping to fight for Germany. Von Braun's stated goal was always to go to space, and his often happens with inventions. They get used for military purposes and weaponized. In 1943, by this time, von Braun was a member of the Nazi SS. He got invited, quote unquote, to join the Nazi SS. You didn't turn down the Nazis because you wouldn't survive long in that climate during the war. And his other interest was that, guess what? The German army had no more money. The Nazis had the money, and he could continue his rocket building program and advance into the V-2. So in October of 1943, von Braun was at a Nazi function. He got drunk. He was saying, we're losing the war. Why are we wasting on money on going to space or trying to fight this war? We could be spending that money on my V-2, and we could achieve the dream of going into space to the moon and other planets. It was considered treason at that time, and he was arrested and he was thrown into prison. Stayed there a couple of weeks until Albert Speer actually went to Hitler and said, you know what? Our Luftwaffe is not successful, and without von Braun, we have no chance of winning this war whatsoever. And so Hitler let him out of prison. So he would be the top of the list. You see him here with the Nazis. You see him right here. And you see him here with his brother Magnus when they surrendered to the Allies in 1945. Of interest, it was Magnus that went down on a bicycle and managed to find an Allied tank corps, negotiate the surrender, and while he was putting his life in jeopardy, Werner right here who'd been in an auto accident, was writing up his resume to hand over. Second is Dr. Ernst Steinhoff. Maybe some of you here knew Dr. Steinhoff. He made his home in Alamogordo for the majority of his life after coming over from Germany. He was considered an absolute genius in aeronautics, and he was the engineer that developed the controller for the V-2 right there. We have one of those in our rocket park outside the museum, the John Stapp Rocket Park. In the late 1930s, he developed a guidance system, and he demonstrated it by taking a group of people up in an airplane. He initiated the beacon flying to Berlin. They initiated the beacon on that end. He left the cockpit. The plane flew itself till they got to Berlin. He went back into the cockpit and brought it down. Absolute genius in aeronautics. As I said, he spent the majority of his life after coming over from Germany here in Alamogordo. He did teach at MIT for a while. He was chief rocket scientist at Holloman Air Force Base, and this is during his induction into the International Space Hall of Fame. Two things about Dr. Steinhoff. One, it was said that speed limits meant nothing to him. And two, there was a teacher in Cloudcroft, Jean Davis. Lou, I think you probably knew Jean. Said at one time when she was very young, she and another young lady, they were in college, they went to a political event in Albuquerque, and they ran into him. And for whatever reason, he was without transportation at the moment. They offered him a ride, and they said he was very nice. He politely declined. They had no idea who he was. And once she learned afterwards, she says, here's this gentleman who survived Hitler's Germany. When he came over on the ship to the United States, his pickup wasn't there. He had to hitchhike to where he wanted to go. And they said he probably got a good laugh out of two teenage girls who offered this old man a ride. The last one would be General Walter Dornberger. And Walter Dornberger was head of the facility off the Baltic coast, Peenemünde, where the V-1s and the V-2s were actually built and tested at the test stands there. Dornberger was indicted for war crimes at the end of the war, and believe it or not, he was acquitted. His men hated him. He always had 3 armed guards with him because there was every opportunity to kill him. Those in the concentration camp who were slave laborers, who built the V-2, hated him. So he always had an armed guard with him. And afterward, he wrote a book, V-2. If you ever get a copy of this, it's a fascinating read. His defense at his trial was that he didn't give any orders, so he was not culpable, and he came back not guilty with the verdict. In this book right here, in my opinion, you'd have to read it and make your own assessment whatsoever. He justifies all of his actions, what he did during the war. At one point, he talks about wanting to resign from his position and go do something else within the Nazi hierarchy. And von Braun and Steinhoff talked him out of it because without that facility, there was no testing the V2s. And then he goes into a long tirade in his book about the moral dilemma he went through about should he resign, should he continue? And there are several sections in that book as to where he does that. And then he came over to the United States and he worked for Bell Aircraft after the war for a time before returning to Germany. So those are the three folks who I would consider were most instrumental into the V2 production and its subsequent use. You can't talk about the V2 without the V1, and that preceded the V2. Von Braun really didn't have any input into that, but it was built at Peenemünde. It was officially known as the Feisler Fi-103 or the Hallenhund, which translates to Hellbound. We called it the flying bomb, the doodle bug, and the buzz bomb. Several years ago, I was giving a tour, and there was an elderly gentleman in that tour from England, and he talked about how, as a very young boy, he would hear the buzz bomb come over. It had a very distinct sound to it, which is one reason it got the name doodle bug. He said, as long as you could hear it, you knew you were safe. As soon as the sound went away, it meant the fuel had run out and you had better find cover. We have a model here of the V1. It was also known as the flying bomb. You're welcome to come up and take a look at it afterward. But it was launched against London for the first time on June 13th of 1944. More than 100 a day were launched against southeast England, a total of 9,521. It was then launched against the port of Antwerp, other places in Belgium. 2,448 of them launched until March 29th of 1945. Now, the Allies at some point captured a V1. It was actually captured in V1. It landed and it did not explode. And so they brought it to the United States and they reverse engineered it. And it became the JB Loon. If you ever want to see a JB Loon, we have two of them. And if you know where our Museum Support Center is across the railroad tracks, it's the metal Quonset hut building. Drive along it to the back, there's a fence there, and sitting right behind the building is a JB Loon. We made thousands of them in this country, shipped them to Germany. We were going to launch them back against Germany, but the war ended and that never actually occurred. There was a plan at some point to actually launch it air to surface, but that was never actually done in combat. I think this right here is an absolutely amazing photograph. This is a Royal Air Force Spitfire, and it has intercepted a V1. Wingtip to wingtip, it is trying to nudge it out of its course to send it off course to where it won't land in a populated area. And then this right here is a V1 that's going into a dive formation before hitting its target. So let's talk about the vengeance aspect of this. Willy Ley, if you're familiar with him, was a journalist who escaped Germany when Hitler first came to power. At that time, it was made pretty well known that those who were journalists, reporters, worked in the media, they were targets for capture and possible extermination. And Ley wrote in an article that was published during World War II, and he said, the full and complete story of the German Rocket Research Laboratory near Peenemünde on the Baltic coast will never be written. He wrote this after the bombing of Peenemünde by the Royal Air Force. He said, there will be nobody alive who can write it. Most of those who knew the full story are dead already. Those that are still alive will die before the war is over. But the main points, the general outline of the story of the creation of that laboratory and more especially the results of its work are known even now, and later efforts will hardly be able to do more than to fill in the details. I'll talk here in a little while about the bombing of Peenemünde by the Air Force, but let's look at Peenemünde. So why did the Germans go into rocketry? Some of you may know that answer. It goes back to World War I. Germany was defeated in that war. They were humiliated in that war, and the Treaty of Versailles prohibited many activities they could take in their military. Their military had to be no more than 100,000 soldiers, men at that time, and prohibited for their use was poison gas, tanks, subs, and any heavy artillery whatsoever. Guess what was not in the Treaty of Versailles? Because it hadn't really been invented at the time, and that was rocketry. So they were free to go about producing this weapon of war, and there were no real international sanctions against it whatsoever. Initially, it was called the Aggregate 4, or the A4 for short. It was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. It was supersonic. You couldn't hear it coming. And as I said earlier, there was not a weapon like this anywhere else in the world. And it was actually conceived in 1936, before it was actively used against the Allies by von Braun. Peenemünde was picked for a couple of reasons. One, it was a fishing village. It was unimportant. Nobody really knew about it. It was out of the way of any coastal traffic. It could be defended from land if there was an invasion from the sea. And it could be defended, since it was at the tip, by the land that spread out to the three sides around it. It would be very easy to see if someone was making an attack gesture. But the RAF eventually found out about it, and they would do overflights, and they mapped it extensively before they decided to attack it. The first attack was on August 17th and 18th of 1943. There were 3 more attacks in 1944. They were able to kind of shut down the production for a time. The Nazis started to back up. They bombed. The Nazis started it back up. Wernher von Braun, in one particular attack, survived because he was able to get inside of a bunker. The Steinhoff family, there were 5 children, I believe, at the time. They had 6 children eventually. One of them only one, the last one born in the United States. And if you knew Rainer Steinhoff, he was a teacher at Alamogordo High School and a coach, who died in 1998 or 1999. The Rainer Steinhoff complex, soccer complex, is named after him because of his activities with the school. They were living in the basement of a tower building, and when the Air Force bombed it, it collapsed down to cellar level. Being in the cellar, that was the only reason they survived. The entire island was captured toward the end of the war by the Soviet Red Army on the 5th of May of 1945. So, who actually built the V-2? You'll see there what comprises the rocket. You'll see its projected trajectory. It was far higher than Mount Everest. Went into the ionosphere. And later, V-2s, as I said, could be more accurately guided by radar. This is the facility on top of Peenemünde, and then on the bottom after one of the final bombings. So the question as to who built the V-2 was slave labor from the concentration camps. In fact, they were taken specifically by a satellite camp of Buchenwald, and that was the Wittelbau Dora, where there were 20,000 folks in that concentration camp over the course of the war who actually lost their lives. 12,000 of them, laborers and concentration camp members, died in the actual building and construction of the V-2 rocket. There's a quote you may have heard, and there are a couple people that quote is attributed to, and Edmund Burke is the one I'm familiar. The only thing needed for evil to survive is for good men to do nothing. 200 Jewish laborers were somewhat familiar with this concept, and they conspired and decided to sabotage the V2. There's no calculating, because they did that, as to how many lives they actually saved because the V2 didn't function as it was supposed to. It didn't take the Nazis very long to figure out who'd done it, and they lined all 200 of these prisoners up in rows. The first row was taken up onto a platform, and they were hung while everybody else watched. The next group was taken up until they had gotten through all 200 of those folks. 200 Jewish men gave their lives so others could live. It was built, for the most part, underground. You can see some of the work being done here. And on the left there, you'll see at the point where it was completed, it was lowered into a horizontal track and then taken out so that it could be taken out to the launch stand. These are a couple more images from inside the actual launch pad itself, or not the launch pad, but the construction area. In fact, the one on this side right here is amazing because it's in color, and color was not well used at that time in our history. So the warhead itself had 2,200 pounds of high explosives. It had a 100-mile range. It could go 60 to 70 miles in altitude. It was the first artificial object to actually travel into space by crossing the edge of space. That line is known, you may be familiar, as the Kármán line. And I'll show you a picture later of one of the first images of the Earth that were taken with the V2. In September of 1944, by now, with the Luftwaffe not able to really function, and the German people really disparaged because of the way the war was going on, Hitler needed a wonder weapon. And all of a sudden, he was more than happy to embrace this technology. In September of 1944, 3,000 plus V2s were launched against London, Antwerp, and other targets. That resulted in the deaths of 9,000 civilians and military personnel, Allied military personnel. Some of the damage, these are where they were launched from. Next slide. This shows you some of the damage right here. There are hundreds of photographs on the internet if you would care to look and see if you can find some. I have a video here, a newsreel from England that will kind of take you to that point in time to see what happened.
Memories of not so long ago, the damage caused by Hitler's last secret weapon, V2, hurled on London in the last desperate months before Germany's final defeat. Today, at Cuxhaven, the V2 is still being fired by Germans, but this time directed by British science. Another launching, with a great weapon leaping 65 miles skywards and reaching 3,000 miles an hour. Under the eyes of science, the rocket trail that once threatened Europe may trace a peaceful path in days to come.
So you can imagine you're a pilot in 1944. You are flying a mission, and all of a sudden, this huge rocket with which you're wholly unfamiliar streaks past you. It would be today like flying in an airplane, looking out the window and seeing a UFO. At that time, that was an unidentified flying object to the pilots. They were first spotted over Leipzig, and Ley wrote in his article, "Suddenly things swished past the flying fortresses so fast that the crews failed to see them clearly. The fighter pilots flying fast Mustangs had a better chance. The strange planes still left the Mustangs behind at a rate of 250 miles per hour or more." The pilots would later say that these Germans were ugly things, looking like bats flying around. Their fuselage was short and stubby, the wings so strongly tapered as to be almost triangular. The fuselage did not project at all beyond the leading edge of the wing in front and only a few feet beyond the trailing edge in the back. So they had no idea what these things were. Churchill, once he learned of it, went to the House of Commons and reported on this. He said, "For the last few weeks, the enemy has been using his new weapon, the long-range rocket, and a number have landed at widely scattered points in this country." Information about the rocket itself was forthcoming quickly, Ley said. Allied airmen saw one take off, describing it as a streamlined projectile about 40 feet long and 15 feet around, shooting a 30-foot flame out of its tail and followed by a long trail of vapor described as looking like a Bronx cheer in smoke. That's what the pilots reported and what Churchill reported. The last under vengeance photograph I have is right here, and this one was the one I referenced earlier that landed at Antwerp and did not explode. It was able to be studied and engineered, which would give us a better chance of offering defense against this rocket. Our next section is victory. So the war is over, Germany surrenders, and a military member by the name of Holger Toftoy, whose expertise was more in the water, in sea, in early submarines, was given the task of, one, getting as many of these German technicians as he could. Some of them had contracts offered by the Soviets, and specifically Ernst Steinhoff. They wanted him, and when they couldn't get him, there was a either get him or kill him order put out. And remember, he was the guy that came to the United States. He's got a price on his head. Nobody picks him up. He's got to go hitchhike to where he's supposed to be. I imagine some heads rolled on that one. The plan that Toftoy came up with, and he would eventually work in Alabama, the plan he came up with was to tell his troops, go through the German countryside, take anything you can get your hands on that looks like it belonged to a rocket. And that's exactly what they did. They took so many things captive, hardware captive. It was put onto ships, and when it was offloaded on the East Coast to come to White Sands Proving Ground, now White Sands Missile Range, it took more than 300 railroad cars to transport those parts here to New Mexico. We worked with the Germans for about a year and a half, 2 years, and eventually they would go to Alabama, to Huntsville, the facility there. But for a period of time, they were active in New Mexico. They were, when they came here with those parts, they were illegals. They were basically snuck into the country. And at one point, they were taken across the Rio Grande in New Mexico, taken to the port of entry and brought back so they could officially be declared that they were legal. And they stayed at Fort Bliss at an old hospital barracks there, and every day they would be trucked to White Sands to do their work. Their families, while they did this, were kept in the American-occupied zone of Germany. They were taken care of. They were fed. They were kept there for a year and a half to 2 years maximum, basically so that these Germans would fulfill their contract and do what they were told to do in hopes of being reunited with their families. So we bring all these parts over. Next slide. We start to build. And about 1946, we make our first launch. And like any new technology, how many of you have gotten a cell phone, doesn't work right the first time? Like any new technology, the first launch did not work well. It lifted off. And this was the bunker that was built. You can actually see this area right here. It is a historic monument. You can see it going to and from Las Cruces. It's got a Hermes missile in there right now. The first lifted off. And these bunkers were built to withstand a direct hit from a V2. They had something like 10-foot thick walls. If you can imagine the windows in there, you really can't see much out of a window when it's in a 10-foot thick concrete wall. So it lifts off. Nobody really can tell what's going on. Somebody says, hey, let's go outside and watch it. So they do. They're on their way out. They look up, and as it's lifting off, it starts to waver, it starts to turn, it looks like it's coming right back at them. They're not interested in staying outside anymore and watching it. They do a quick turnaround and they're rushing back into the building. The problem was that there were still people inside the building trying to get out. And it was a mad circus for a few minutes. And every launch after that, it was declared that a guard was put on the internal door, and no one got out until the area was deemed absolutely safe to do so. So as I said, technology does not always work the first time. You can see an explosion that actually occurred on a liftoff. You can see the resultant pits when a V2 impacted the ground. There was a program at the time, because White Sands is so massive. White Sands, Holloman, and Fort Bliss, McGregor Range, are the largest contiguous land masses in the Department of Defense inventory. So a V2 would lift off, it wouldn't function properly, it would hit the ground, and nobody knew where it was. They could kind of pinpoint the area, but it hit with such force that it would bury itself. There was a program that trained dogs to smell. They manufactured with some chemicals oil from sharks, and they would put these on the V2s. And the dogs were able to find them buried underground for up to a year after they crashed. See a V2 preparing to do what it's not supposed to do, and then the resultant crash right over here. There were two crashes off base. One of them hit this field right out here. Some of you might know Bob Calloway. He's retired now, lives up in High Rolls. He was in high school at the time. I believe he was a senior. He did an oral history for us. He owned Calloway's Firestone. And one day, he and his friends were riding around Alamogordo in a pickup truck, and they saw this V2 fly over. They heard it crash into the mountainside. And the next day, they decided to go up and see what was going on. Well, they got beat to the punch by other people in Alamogordo who ran up there and started stealing secret parts off of the V2, including cameras. The military went door to door and got all of their secret parts back. So Calloway the next day and his friends drive up there and they find the scene being cleaned up. They talked with the military members who, when it was over, gave them fuel tanks that they turned into welding tanks, portable welding tanks. They gave them wiring, and these young men decided they were going to learn about rocketry. And with all of this stuff they got off of the V2, they started building model rockets. It evidently so inspired Bob Calloway that he became an Air Force fighter pilot. And when he returned to Alamogordo after his career, he was a city commissioner and he owned Calloway's Firestone until he retired. The other one, and I've got an article here, thanks to Lou Gilliam back there, that talks about the V2 crash in Juarez, Mexico. Now, I've heard some great stories from different people for years. Basically, the problem was dealing with the gyroscope, and it went up, was supposed to go north, didn't, went south, went over the border, and hit outside of a cemetery in Juarez, about 30 miles from the downtown business district, according to this article, and made a 50-foot crater. Some of the stories I've heard were that when we got down there, they found a guy selling tickets to see the missile America bombed Mexico with. But the article talks about the V2, which was a modified V2. It was actually a Hermes 2. The 4-ton vehicle struck going more than 2,000 miles an hour. The energy released in that impact created a crater 25 feet deep and 50 feet across in rocky ground. If you've ever tried to dig in rocks, it's very difficult. Witnesses said there was still smoke in the air when they arrived. The bushes were burning, the ground was hot, and they likened it to something similar if an asteroid or a meteor would actually impact the Earth. Some people in El Paso thought that the crash, it's really too close for comfort. The president of the New Mexico Cattle Growers Association called for the Army to move their testing range somewhere else. Like the Pacific Ocean, where if it crashed, it would go into the water, they said. They got a hold of New Mexico Senator Carl Hatch, who wrote a letter to the Secretary of War asking that they move it elsewhere. For the most part, they weren't concerned. It was a rare occurrence, and the Las Cruces Sun-News accused El Paso of overreacting. And obviously, the missile range has never moved. So those two, a lot of crashes on the base, those two off base. Some more damage you see from some V2 crashes. Talked about the shark oil. So finally, after a year or two here, the story about the Germans and the V2s started to get out. If you were here when we showed the Woody Woodpecker cartoon, they talked about a V2 going to the moon. I have some science fiction amazing stories magazines at home where there are fiction stories by well-known authors about the V2 going to the moon from White Sands, and even Popular Science in their May 1947 issue talked about the V2 in the next couple of years could actually go to the moon. So that started really to create a lot of fervor that was the beginning of the space race. And that leads us finally to the V2 vehicle. You can make a very successful argument that if not for the V2, as I said earlier, who knows what the evolution of our rocket program might have been if we had not managed to bring German scientists here. If you're a German scientist, you want to go to the Soviet Union or do you want to come here? It was pretty clear. Although some of them did take contracts at the Soviet Union, they fulfilled their contracts and the Russians let them come back home. So they fulfilled both sides of that contract. But arguably, if not for the V2, it would have negatively impacted, looking in hindsight, negatively impacted our space program. If you go by and look at the JB Loon, the V2 was guided by graphite vanes. And they're in the very bottom here. Those vanes would move, V-A-N-E-S, and that would help to guide them. We have right in front of the JB Loon out at the Museum Support Center, a Redstone rocket. This is the Army version. It's green. It's cut into parts because of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, the SALT Treaty. And if you look, you can see this rocket conceived in the late 1930s. In the 1960s, we were flying the Redstone, and it is using the exact same guidance system. And you can see those vanes looking through the fence. So if not for that rocket, it's one of those what-if situations. But as I mentioned, the word started to get out. We're having some success with our rocket program. When you have success, what do you want? You want publicity. And the V2 started showing up in science fiction, as I mentioned, in magazines such as Popular Science. Next slide, please. You can see Von Braun by the F1 engines of the Saturn V. This is the guy that conceived of the V1 or the V2 and spearheaded building the Saturn V that took us out of the atmosphere to go to the moon. it started showing up in what were known as comics books at the time. So not only adults reading amazing stories or technicals such as popular science, popular mechanics, but this information was being put in front of children that we're going to go to the moon one day. And you probably can't calculate how many kids this might have inspired to go to school, become engineers, and went on to work in a rocket field, a scientific field. Not only that, but you can find online Walt Disney's pairing with von Braun and some of the other German scientists in presenting programs on television in 1955 and 1957 that basically sold space to the American public. And you can see that von Braun's conception of a rocket really hadn't changed much. There's a question as to where did he get this design? Basically, it's aerodynamic. It works very well. But he may have gotten this actual design from a gentleman I mentioned earlier, and that was Dr. Hermann Ober. If you've ever seen the German movie Frau im Mond, or Woman in the Moon, when he was younger, Dr. Ober was actually hired to build that rocket as a model that was used in the film itself. And as we go along, next slide, same basic concept. All right, if you've anybody ever seen the movie Destination Moon? What's unique to me about that film, for its time, it was actually a very well done film talking about the space program. But what's unique to me is in that film is an actual clip of a rocket, a V-2 modified, launched at White Sands. Now, I'll warn you that the resultant crash was cheesy Hollywood special effects. So why don't you pop to the next slide there and show us that video.
It is just 1 minute before takeoff time in the uninhabited desert of White Sands, New Mexico.
Tell them to stand by for count-off and firing.
59, 58, 57.
But to reach this dramatic moment were months of construction, checking every detail 1,000 times, and a desperate struggle to convince the skeptical, to outwit those who would stop us, to muster up courage to challenge the black, airless void of terror-stricken space.
Come back to me, Charles. Please, come back.
17, 16, 15.
All right, take it away!
13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, fire!
So the V-2 showed up in movies, it showed up in television, it showed up in comic books, it showed up in magazines, and it's still being made by Estes, I think, in a model rocket. We have one of these model rockets right here that you're welcome to come up and take a look at if you'd like. Got two more slides. One, I mentioned earlier that the very first image of space was taken from a V-2 launched at White Sands in, I believe, August of 1946. And that is a frame from the film that was taken right there. First of all, you can see the curvature of the Earth, which the flat Earth guys can't explain. And you can see the White Sands in that image as well. If you would like to see a V-2, we have the base of a V-2 rocket out here along with the controller. But next slide, White Sands Missile Range has an actual restored V-2. What I've read, there are only 19 fully restored V-2s left in the world. And White Sands has one of them in their museum. It's a free museum. You just go up to the gate, show your ID, you get a pass, and you can walk in and see it, see the rocket park and other displays that they have there. So the V-2 wonder weapon of war for Adolf Hitler that he didn't embrace until way too late. It influenced every other rocket pretty much to come in the evolution of the space age in our country. It was a dream of von Braun and others to go to space, which is why it was built. It was weaponized, used as a weapon of war, but eventually it came over here and we used it then to fulfill his dream, build larger rockets that would take us out of the atmosphere and go explore space. Does anybody, next slide, have any questions that I can try to answer?
How many did they build total?
There were something more than 5,000, I think. V2s actually, yeah, because they launched 3,000 here and 2,000 there, so there were more than 5,000 that were built. A lot of that with the slave labor. Donna.
If the Luftwaffe didn't have a fuel for airplanes, how did they come up with fuel for the rockets?
The rocket fuel was completely different. It's actually, in fact, the General Dornberger talks about they were camouflaging. They were putting their airplanes under trees and bushes and camouflaging them so the Allies couldn't find them and destroy them. But one of the main components of rocket fuel for the V2, think about this the next time you look in your medicine cabinet, was hydrogen peroxide. And now what we have in our medicine cabinet is far less potent in strength, but in a higher concentration, H2O2 I believe it is, it can be very explosive. So yeah. And again, the army under which the Luftwaffe came had no money, which is why von Braun went to the Nazis. They had money to be able to do this. He still held on to that dream. There are a lot of theories and websites and conspiracy sites that talk about him having been at the underground facility and knowing about the slaves. It apparently weighed very heavy on his mind because after coming to the United States, he had an epiphany and became very religious. On his gravestone is basically his name, date of birth, date of death, and his favorite scripture from Psalms. And that's it. His wife hated publicity. He was dead and buried in 24 hours before they announced it.
Where's that?
It is in Huntsville, Alabama. What else?
Cliff.
Yes.
You had that picture of a Spitfire
Yes.
pushing the V1
Yes.
off course. How fast does the V1 go that a Spitfire could do that? Did the Spitfire just kind of parallel or just fly and let the V1 catch up with it and then nudge it?
You know, the article I read didn't say, but that's a really good question. Could it have been at the end of could it have run out of fuel and was getting ready to impact and he was pushing it out of the way? That's an answer I don't know, but I'll see if I can do some more research.
Just curious what the airspeed of a V1 was in order to...
Well, it's not a rocket, so it's subsonic.
I don't think it would have had that.
Subsonic.
Well, it still has to have some airspeed in order to continue.
Yeah, it's prop versus yeah. That's a really good question. I don't know. I'll see if I can find out.
A lot of the later aircraft in World War II were approaching speeds like that because of the, Merlin engines and things like that in there. It wasn't uncommon at all for a fighter to be flying, 480 or so. And some of the dive bombers and stuff at the end of World War II were actually breaking the speed or the speed of sound during the dives, and it was killing the pilots because it was disrupting the airflow around the airplanes, and they didn't know about it until a couple of guys finally survived And they survived by putting their feet up on the instrument panels and pulling for everything that they were worth, you know, to get the airplane to slow down and flatten out a little bit, you know, but the speeds were really getting up there during World War II.
One thing, that pilot had courage to do that. Yes.
If we trust Google, it says that the V1 flew between 340 and 400 miles per hour.
Yeah, see, that's well within a range of the Spitfires and Mustangs and those aircraft.
Interesting. Thank you. Yes.
The V2 that we dissected, why was it built wrong, or did it poop out, or what?
No, nobody really knows. It just did not detonate. Hit and did not detonate. And so in Antwerp, they put it on a trailer and brought it into the public arena so that people could see it. You know, I'm not sure you'd want to be near there. There was I can't remember what the name of it was, but during the space race, the Soviets had a large rocket that never lifted off, and they waited and they waited and they came out, and for some reason it ignited and it vaporized 200 people. So yeah, you've got this weapon that could explode. I don't think that would be something I would want to go up and see up close. Fortunately, that didn't happen. All right, well, thank you very much. Feel free to come on up and look at the V2 we have here, the V1 model we have. I would highly encourage, if you can get a copy of Walter Dornberger's book, to read it and make your own conclusions on what part he actually had in the war. There's a lot of material out there. It's all very, very fascinating. And probably Lay was right. We'll never know the full extent of what went on, because after the bombing, a majority of those scientists and the workers were killed. All of the records were lost. Thank you.